Pulsar Audio has released Posidon, and it's an emulation of the EQ of the famous Trident consoles. The plugin is named Poseidon because that old ancient god uses a trident. Get the link? Pulsar Audio could have also chosen for Aquaman or Fork for that matter. Visually, Posidon looks very similar to Pulsar Audio's own W495 EQ, because of the way the graphical frequency display is done. And you control the frequency bands in the same way. The first way is with, let's call it, the old-fashioned way, where you get a fader for the level and a dial for the frequency, and knobs for mid, side or stereo usage. They all have a nice fitting pearly look. The plugin is called Posidon after all. The other way is to use the graphical display. You simply drag the frequency pointer around and you get all additional controls in a pop-up. There are differences between the graphical and knobs control. With the knobs, double-clicking will reset either level or frequency. With the graphical display, pressing Shift and dragging a band will enable monitoring for that band. But you cannot change level this way, unfortunately. I hope this can be implemented in an update. Now let's get to the most important part of the plugin, the sound. But please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already and hit that little like button. Posidon has 3 input saturation drive modes: Trident, Pulsar and Off. The Trident mode is the one based on the console and has very even distributed harmonics. The Pulsar is newly created. It starts off very clean, but is more aggressive when you turn up the drive. You can see that with the more irregular distribution of the harmonics. You also can see aliasing when you push the drive, but the oversampling option nicely takes care of that. Furthermore, the plugin is zero latency and barely hits the CPU in this test. The input drive does something which you normally have to do with the knobs. When you increase drive, you usually have to reduce the output to compensate in increased level. Posidon does this for you. It's a sort of auto gain, but it has nothing to do with the specialized auto gain switch here. More on that later. The input drive saturation has a huge impact on transients and sound, and I find it shows best on drums. Let me toggle both saturation modes. This saturation drives into the EQ, and the plugin itself at default with the Trident mode has a slight high and low end roll-off. It's under a decibel at 20 Hz and slightly above a decibel at 20 kHz, and this is regardless of which sample rate you work in. Below 20 Hz, the high pass has enough cut to remove subsonic frequencies, and that is nice for your overall headroom. In Pulsar mode, the plugin starts off flat. The EQ of the Posidon has 4 adjustable bands. They are a low and high shelf and 2 bell-shaped bands, all with a maximum of boost or cut of 15 decibels. The Trident EQ does not have a variable width control, and the EQ curves are pretty unique. One thing you don't see that often is that this plugin has auto gain for the EQ, which I find to be very handy because it compensates for the difference in level due to the EQ. For the next bit I leave it off. For the lower mid band you get this white bell boost, and when you turn up the frequency you see and hear that more and more extra higher frequencies get added. The bell gets wider. The same behavior happens with cut. The higher midband has a sort of inverted behavior when you compare it to the lower midband. It starts more focused on the higher frequencies and gets wider on the lower ends when you move the band to lower frequencies. The high and low shelf act in a very traditional way, where change in frequency affects the width of the total cut or boost. In addition to these four bands you get a high and low pass filter. The high pass has a very subtle slope and it extends really high, making it a very musical high pass. The low pass is very interesting as well. It has this slight frequency bump just before the actual cut. This can help to clean up the high frequencies while also slightly bringing up the high or mid range. This all and in the way the bands interact with each other give you very interesting and complicated EQ curves. You really have to listen to get the best results, because these bands don't act like your bread and butter type of stock EQ. And there's even more. The plugin gives you two output transformers, and they are there to work on the very low end, to add some beef, so to say. The amount of drive is also controlled by the input. I would have preferred to see a separate control for that. The biggest difference you hear is when you have the input drive saturation also enabled. The input and output saturation work nicely together. One thing, the input saturation stage is actually placed before the EQ. That means you cannot EQ into this saturation with this plugin, which is a choice, but you might wonder how nice it would be to also have an option to EQ into this good sounding saturation for extra flexibility and tone shaping. Let me show you with the W495, which feeds into the Posidon. There's absolutely some nice tone shaping you could do it this way. This is a very lovely EQ and saturation device for that matter. I loved it as first EQ in a plugin chain. It works as a preamp with EQ like that. Mine is a dedicated compressor. Here it is as only plugin on all tracks of this small mix. Auto gain is enabled and I'll A/B between all plugins on and off. And as usual, try Posidon out to see if it fits in your audio tool shed.